Good morning, people of Carleton Memorial. This is my Merrickville week, so I am coming to you from my office in Merrickville United Church. Our scriptures this week are all about the baptism of Jesus. So as with last week, I will put a link to the scriptures down below so that you can see what it is I'm talking about, but I'm not going to take your time reading them. You can go and read them on your own. So if you want to pause first and go read, then you should do that, and I'm just going to carry on talking about them. So our scriptures are talking about the baptism of Jesus. And this is an event that happens in different Gospels in different ways. But in this week, we are looking at Luke's Gospel. And we're really only reading a fraction of the story. And I'm not totally clear why those choices were made about which verses to read. But that's what we've got, is just a few verses from the story. So I thought I'd give just a bit of a background to the story, and then talk about it a little bit. So what we are seeing is Jesus's encounter with John the Baptist, and this is a really important moment in Jesus' gospel, because one of the things we know is that the followers of John become the followers of Jesus. So as John's ministry is ending because he's arrested and then beheaded, those are the people who come to follow Jesus. And Jesus' ministry doesn't really begin until John is in jail. And so John the Baptist, in a lot of ways, sets the stage for Jesus and for his preaching. John's a wild and crazy guy. He was a mystic, basically, would be the word we might use today. He lived in the wilderness. There's all kinds of colorful descriptions about him, dressing only in camel hair and eating only locusts and honey and all kinds of those sorts of things. He was definitely a firebrand. He spoke quite openly against the powers that be, which is why he had to live in the wilderness. It was not safe for him in society. But he also was very, very clear that he saw his role as preparing the way. He was not the Messiah. He was quite clear about that. But he was preparing the way for the one who would be the Messiah. So that's his ministry. And what was different, so the idea of kind of a crazy preacher in the wilderness baptizing people was not unusual at this point in Jewish history. There were a number of others who came and went, and they would gather their flocks around them, and at a certain point, their followers would either deliberately incite a rebellion, or those in power would determine that they were a threat and would hunt them down. One way or the other, just about all of these preachers ended up the same way, which is to say that they ended up dead, and those who followed them ended up either dead or scattered to the winds. What's different about John is that he doesn't permit his followers to stay with him. So people would come to him, he would preach, he would baptize, and baptize in these days is full immersion. So you go into the river, you go down under the water, and you come back up. None of this water on the forehead stuff. But then he would tell people to go home, that they were not to stay with him, and that seems to be quite well supported. That's not just the Gospel's opinion of him. That's history's opinion of him. And I think that goes to his understanding that he was not, in fact, the Messiah. He was one who prepared the way for the Messiah. And so he didn't want his people hanging around with him. He wanted them to go back home and wait until the Messiah came. One of the effects of this decision, from a practical point of view, is it made it very hard for the authorities to hunt down his followers. So John's followers come to be a network of poor and rich alike, scattered around the countryside, in every little town and village and every city corner, but they aren't identifiable easily. So you can't call them heretics and just have them executed. Similarly, John is not does not appear to be a big threat, as much as he's saying a lot of stuff, as much as he's um, certainly a visible problem in some kinds of ways. There's no crowd gathering, and that makes it really hard to justify arresting him. He's just one crazy man spouting off in the wilderness. He's not even in downtown Jerusalem. He's just out in the middle of nowhere in a river. And so as a result, John's ministry is actually more successful in many ways than most of his compatriots from that time in history. And a part of what we see in John then is the baptism of Jesus. And so Jesus goes to be baptized by John, as so many others have. And his baptism is in some ways unremarkable. It's at the same with a bunch of other people. Like, it's not a unique occasion. There's nothing to label Jesus as the Messiah before this baptism. He just is baptized. And it's only after his baptism that there is some kind of experience. And our Gospels describe it in slightly different ways, but essentially this feeling like those around are aware that this is a special person. That so Luke's Gospel talks about the Holy Spirit descends in bodily form like a dove. So a dove comes and lands on his head, and they hear a voice from heaven. You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. Without getting too hung up on the how historical or not the details are, I think the concept is the important part, which is that although Jesus's baptism in form is the same as everybody else's, there is a sense that there is something special happening here. Now, it's very clear Jesus' ministry does not begin immediately following the baptism, no matter how remarkable it was. He goes off and spends time in the wilderness, and it's only when John is arrested that Jesus begins his work. So on the one hand, you have this remarkable, unusual baptism. On the other hand, nothing actually changes at the moment of the baptism. The change doesn't come until much later. I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of how we understand baptism. Historically, we have talked about baptism as almost a magic thing, that without baptism, a person cannot know the love and grace of God. And that was the position for a long time in the Christian church, and still is in much of the Christian church, that if you are not baptized, then there is no hope for you. And that's common in many different parts of Christianity to certain degrees. One of the things I find fascinating about the Mormons, for example, is that they have a practice of baptizing those who are already deceased. And that is with that understanding that you can't come into the grace of God unless you are baptized. But you know, the good news is you can get baptized even after you've been dead for hundreds of years. So if you go to Salt Lake City or your local Mormon temple, you can sign up all of your ancestors to be baptized as Mormons posthumously. So you never know. You might already be a baptized Mormon, and you might not even know it, because that's how they understand these things. but again, it's that, and so you will see, for example, it's a common Hollywood trope, right? The idea that of the baptism right before death, the idea that there needs to be a baptism for a child, a baby born right away who's critically ill. We need to baptize them quickly before they die, otherwise they have no hope. Um, and that comes from that very magical understanding of baptism, that without baptism there is uh, no love from God. Apologies for the interruption there. That's the beauty of a recorded service. I can just pause for a second and stitch it all together before I upload it. So I was talking about the magical understanding of baptism. Um, so the question, I guess, is how we understand baptism in a more modern context. And this is one of those places where the United Church has really struggled with its own theology and with its own understanding. Um, in practice, in the United Church of Canada, baptism is to a particular congregation. Um, so we are, for example, a United Church baptism is always to be done in the context of congregational worship, except in emergency circumstances. And so that emergency circumstance right there, why do we need an emergency circumstance? Why do we need an emergency baptism? Um, how do we understand what baptism accomplishes? We don't have a very clear understanding of that. If we understood baptism in the kind of the more traditional way, that baptism is this moment at which a person becomes committed to God, then it wouldn't be necessary to have a congregation there. And so in many different denominations, baptism is not done during the context of normal congregational worship. It's done at a separate event, sometimes right after a Sunday morning service, sometimes entirely different time, entirely different context. There are lots of churches in the world that have pools in their sanctuary, and then there are lots of churches that baptize at a separate time at a river nearby or anything like that. But our United Church doctrine is very clear that baptism is to happen on a Sunday morning in the context of a congregation. And a part of what happens in our baptism service, part of what we are required to do as clergy in the United Church, is to baptize someone into a congregation, and for the congregation to participate in that, in welcoming a person as a new member. So that is a different understanding in many ways than some of our sister denominations. So if you are baptized Roman Catholic, if you're baptized Anglican, you are baptized and then you move around congregations, you go to whichever congregation you want, but your baptism doesn't really change. In the United Church, if you were to move congregations, then there's actually a whole separate process and ceremony by which your membership is transferred from one congregation to another. And in that process, when that happens, the new congregation makes promises. It's participatory. Again, it happens in a Sunday morning worship, and the new congregation promises to welcome you in using the same language that the congregation did when you were baptized. And you make the same promises again, not all of them, but the ones that pertain to the congregation. So there's a partial redoing of the baptism. I don't want to overstress that too much. We're only baptized once in the United Church. But there is a very clear link to congregational life that says baptism for us is not only about our relationship with God, but also about our relationship with the congregation. And I think part of that is the beginnings of an attempt to move away from the magical baptism. the other side of magical baptism historically, after all, is that it encourages very discriminatory behavior by churches, that it encourages churches to adopt a position that if you are not baptized, therefore God doesn't love you, therefore we can kill you, we can take your land, we can consider you less of a person and less important in God's eyes because you are not baptized. And so that line of thinking then has fueled any number of horrendous practices over the history of Christianity. I don't know that we have a simple solution to that. In fact, I know we do not have a simple solution to that. It is a complicated and complex part of our history. That said, it's clear to me that we are re-examining how we understand the importance of baptism, the importance of membership in the church, the importance of all of those things. They are, it's clear, they are essential to our operation as an institution. What's not clear is how important that is to God. And I think that is one of the places where the United Church is finding itself in a bit of a difficult place right now. That we struggle with that bit of a disconnect between the institutional needs and what we understand as an institution, theologically, about God's needs. One of the ways this has come up repeatedly in church history, just quickly, is around involvement of young people in the life of the denomination. So we as the United Church, unlike many other denominations, we invite children to participate in baptism from the moment they are born. We consider children to be equally valuable members of God's family. That is not the case in a lot of Christian churches. Children certainly are valuable, but there is a clear line between of hierarchy based on age. At the same time, we have a concept in our rules of full membership, which is that a child is a member, but not a full member. Full members have to be confirmed. And so that made a certain amount of sense historically when we had lots and lots of kids and there was a confirmation class every year and every kid did confirmation, and that made sense. One of the realities of the modern church is that no longer makes sense in the majority of our congregations. We don't have enough kids to run confirmation class in vast majority of our congregations, certainly not to run a confirmation class every year. And so you have young people who are teenagers, even young adults, who are very involved in the life of their congregation, but technically not full members. And we don't know how to deal with that as an institution. If you ask us as individuals, we will say these people are enormously valuable to us and an important part of the life of the congregation and have lots of important things to say. But then when it's time to, for example, vote on a new minister, or when it's time to send representatives to general council, all of a sudden, these 16, 17-year-old, 18, 19-year-olds who haven't been confirmed are all of a sudden officially not allowed. And we know that feels wrong, but we also don't know how to deal with it as an institution. That's a part of the weird world we find ourselves in. I don't want to go on a lot longer. So just to say that how we understand baptism is not a static thing by any means. Baptism was, for a period of time, the same for men and women, and yet women were not able to participate the same as men. Baptism has been limited on the basis of race. Baptism has been limited on the basis of age at different points in time. Baptism has been limited on the basis of nationality, or different denominations may or may not recognize each other's baptisms. For the record, the United Church recognizes all baptisms, but other denominations are not so welcoming. So it is a complicated, it is a very complicated scenario that we find ourselves in. And I think one of the challenges that will face our denomination over the next little while as we continue to shrink and rearrange. How do we understand what this means? How do we understand what membership and participation means? And how does all of that and our institutional needs gel with what we understand to be important to God? I don't have those answers, but they are a fascinating conversation that we will be having as a denomination for a while yet. I hope you have a good week. I will be back in the pulpit recording this next week for you folks, and look forward hopefully to seeing you in February. So far that still seems possible, and we'll just see where we go with that. Let us pray. God of us all, be with us in love. Help us to be welcoming and loving. Help us to be accepting of each other, open in our understanding, and help us to see your love in all that we meet. Amen.